Welcome back to the Adoption Squad, the mini-sode, and thanks for listening. I'm your host, Mary. Annie will join us for our next full episode on Wednesday. Today we will focus on one of our listeners in this mini-sode. Jim Serrano wrote to us to share his adoption experience. Here is his story. It's titled Twice Adopted by Jim Serrano. You are probably wondering why I called my story Twice Adopted. Well, here's the journey and the facts as to why the title sums up my life. I was adopted at 2 weeks of age, and the second adoption was 7 years ago when I found unconditional love from my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I guess this is where I started the beginning. I was adopted when I was 2 weeks old by my parents, Joe and Lupe Serrano, which was 45 years ago. I was raised in Gilroy, California, and grew up in a very strict household. The first time I found out that I was adopted, I was about 11 years old. My parents, brothers, and sisters would tell me that they got me at the supermarket all through my teenage years. I always had it in the back of my mind that maybe I was adopted. I acted out a lot, which meant I had anger, drugs, and alcohol issues. And also at the age of 10 to 11, I was being molested by a male cousin. I always felt unworthy because of my birth parents giving me up for adoption. I figured they didn't want me. Many years later, when I was dating my wife and we were eating dinner, and I told her I had something to tell her. So I told her I was adopted, and she said it was okay. Yet in the back of my mind, I thought she would think that there was something wrong with me because my birth parents gave me up for adoption. This was 25 years ago. The next part of the journey would be actually starting to search for my birth parents. Back in 1999, I was watching a TV program about adoption, and the program explained how to get unidentifying information. So I decided it was time for me to look for myself and for my 12-year-old daughter. My journey began with going to my parents and letting them know that I was going to search for my birth parents, and if they could please give me all of the information that they had. My parents' reaction was, why? I remember my dad telling me, are you prepared to find out what's out there? My mom was asking if I was trying to replace them. I told them no, but I needed to find out who I was. The information I got said I was born in San Jose and was adopted through the county. I work in San Jose driving a concrete truck. So one day after work, I went to the county office and asked if I could get my unidentifying information. The woman at the desk told me that those records are closed and I could not get the information that I wanted. I came home disappointed and told my wife what had happened. She told her brother, so he decided to call the social worker that I spoke to and convinced her to call me back in her office to sign a waiver so I could get the information. But it could take up to a year to get that information. 2 months later, the information came in the mail. It stated that my mother was 5 feet, 95 pounds, and she worked in a doctor's office. She was 25 years old at the time of my birth. My father was Mexican, brown hair and eyes, 5'6", and had a 10th grade education and also worked full-time. It was a brief affair and they were not interested in marriage. About 3 months later, at my place of employment, I was delivering concrete to a job site and I was talking to a gentleman I have known for 20 years, whose name is Carlos. He asked me what I had been up to and I told him I was looking for my birth parents. He proceeded to ask me if I had any information, and I told him all that I knew. He then told me that the information about my birth mother sounded like a girl he knew named Marie, who he had dated in the early 60s. I began to tell him about my birth family, which described him to a T. I called my wife and told her what had happened, and if she could read me the information about my birth father. I went back to the job site and asked Carlos how far he went in high school. And he asked me that he only went up to 10th grade. We then just looked at each other and thought maybe we were father and son. I asked him if he knew how to get a hold of Marie, and he said he would try to find her, but it had been 38 years since he had seen her. 2 weeks later, I was talking to a fellow coworker, and he told me he used to date Carlos' daughter, and that he would call her so that we could meet. Meanwhile, Carlos and I decided to take a blood test. About 9 weeks later, I got the results in the mail saying that we were not father and son, which was one of the worst days of my life. When I told him about it, we were both devastated. 6 months passed, and my wife was talking to a neighbor, and she told her that her husband was adopted. So my wife shared with her that I was adopted also. The neighbor told my wife that her husband went to adoptive identity discovery meeting, and that's how he found his birth parents. So I decided to go to the Santa Clara meeting because I was adopted in San Jose. While at this meeting, I met a gentleman who helped me with my search. We gave him all of my information, and he told me he would have a name for me by the time that I got home. He called me that night and gave me my birth mother's maiden name. Meanwhile, my adopted mother found out she had breast cancer, so the guilt started to dig deep into my heart. I thought, how could I keep going on with the search? So I decided to keep looking. 6 months passed, and we narrowed my birth mother's maiden name to 3 women and 3 addresses. One of them was in San Jose where I worked. So one day I was delivering concrete and saw the address, so I pulled over and knocked on the door and asked if they had ordered concrete. The person that answered the door was my brother, but I didn't know it at the time. 3 weeks passed, and the gentleman helping me called me and told me that he had found my birth mother, and the address that I stopped at 3 weeks ago was where she lived. I got her phone number and called her that night. She answered the phone, and I asked her if any of her sons were home, and she said no and asked me who I was, and I told her my name was Jim Serrano and that she didn't recognize my name. I asked her if January 22nd, 1962 meant anything to her, and there was a dead silence. She then proceeded to ask why I was saying these things and asked who it was, and I told her, "This is who you think it is." So she told me she couldn't talk and to call her tomorrow morning. I hung up and told my wife what happened and was so anxious, confused, and numb. My wife didn't want me to drive home. So later that night, my wife and I were talking, and the phone rang, and it was my birth mother, Norberta. And she asked me if we could meet the next day at a Valley Medicare in San Jose because she had an appointment for her kids that morning. I agreed to meet her the next morning, so we meet in the parking lot of Valley Medical. When we saw each other, we locked eyes, and she hugged me and cried and told me that she was sorry, although I had no emotions. She asked me to go along to the appointments she had for her kids. After the appointments, we talked, and she told me that her husband and kids didn't know anything about me. She told me that God gave her a second chance with me, so she was going to tell her husband and kids about me. She said that she was scared that her husband was going to kick me out of the house. Later on that night, Norberta called me and said that her husband and kids were excited to meet me. A week later, I met her husband and my 2 brothers. I didn't get to meet my sister because she lived in Montana at the time. One thing I noticed was a lot of young children living in her home. Later that night, we spoke on the phone, and I asked her who all of these children were. She stated that they were all of her foster children and that they were foster parents for the last 25 years. She said that she was paying God back for what she did 38 years ago by giving me up for adoption. At the same time, I didn't tell my adopted parents about the meetings. I asked Norberta of Carlos Bryant, or if Carlos Bryant was my father, and she told me no. that my father's name is Raul Coca. She had not seen him in 39 years, but she knew where his brother worked. So I went to where Raul's brother worked, and that was Hank Coca Furniture in San Jose. A week later, I was working, so I pulled up in front of the store, and I asked for Hank Coca, but he was not there. So I spoke to Hank Coca Jr. and asked how I could get a hold of Raul Coca. He asked me who I was, and I told him that I was his son. He was shocked and surprised. I left my phone number and name, and also left Norberta's name, and if he could contact me. About a month later, Norberta had a barbecue at her home so I could meet the rest of the family. On the way home, my wife and I were talking about how well the party went and how nice all of my new relatives are. But the only downside was that I hadn't heard from Raul Coca. When we got home, there was a message from Raul on the answering machine. We spoke the next day, and we decided to meet that week for lunch. So we met, and we looked a lot like each other. He told me he didn't know anything about me. He also told me that he has never married or had any children. So he asked me if I wanted to go and see where my grandparents were buried. So we went to the cemetery, and one thing I noticed was that Norberta's parents were buried close by. I decided that I wanted to take a blood test to make sure that Raul was my biological father. So 6 weeks later, the results were positive that he was actually my biological father. Then a few weeks later, my wife, daughter, and I went to Pacifica to meet the rest of the Coca family. After meeting both families, we kept talking to each other for weeks. My 39th birthday was coming up, and I found out a week before that Norberta was going to throw me a surprise party in Gilroy with all of my family and friends from both sides. I wasn't feeling happy about it because I knew my parents were not comfortable with meeting my birth mother. So that night when I walked into the party, I had to act like I was surprised, but actually I was extremely uncomfortable because my parents were sitting at the same table as Norberta. That night, I proceeded to get drunk so I could just not worry about the situation, because I remember that when my mom and dad left the party, my dad said we would be talking about it tomorrow. The next day, while I was home, my heart pounded extremely fast and hard. I told Tina to call an ambulance because I thought that I was having a heart attack. I ended up in the ICU for 3 days, but the doctor said it wasn't a heart attack, but actually an anxiety attack. I spoke to a therapist a week later, and he started giving me Paxil for depression. I was out of work for a month. The first day I returned to work, I was speaking to a friend on the job site, and he was really listening to my trials and asked me to attend church with him on Friday night. I told him maybe, but Friday came and I decided to go to his church. I was late, but he was still waiting for me on the steps, so my wife and I started going to his church in San Jose for about a month. One morning before service started, I was getting an anxiety attack, so I went to look for my medication and felt better. After the first worship song, I accepted the Lord on that day, March 1st, 2001. I went that day and threw away the Paxil, told my therapist that week what I did, but he said it was dangerous for me to do that. I knew the Lord had healed me, but now I know my life is going great even in my trials. I know the Lord will give me peace in my life. I know you're probably wondering about why I called my testimony Twice Adopted. It is because in Ephesians 1:5, which speaks about being adopted as sons of God, and it was all planned before we were born. Signed by Jim Serrano. Thank you, Jim, for writing and sharing this with all of us. It takes a great amount